Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session in our Horizon series of webinars. LRIC initiated this series of webinars as a part of our mission to help create a robust future for the livestock value chain. The topics covered directly impact the future of Ontario's livestock sector, and today's regarding greenhouse gas is certainly one that's very timely. Our intent is to provide a good starting point to learn about a topic from someone with deep knowledge in that area, and to provide additional resources of credible information for follow-up. Each webinar is complemented with a white paper featuring a well-known and respected expert in the topic area. During the presentation, please submit your questions with the Q&A function, and at the end, Jean Howden will bring these forward for discussion. And now I'll ask Chloe to introduce today's speaker. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Mike. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Claudia Wagner-Riddle, Professor of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. Dr. Wagner-Riddle is a contributing editor along with her research associate, Dr. Susantha Jayasundara, to the second white paper and is here to speak on that topic, livestock and greenhouse gases. The Wagner-Riddle Lab at the University of Guelph is a research program which calculates the carbon footprint of food, feed, and fuel produced by agriculture by using the net emissions of greenhouse gases. Claudia has published over 120 papers and is a fellow of the Soil Science Society of America and editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Agriculture, Rural and Forest Meteorology. Claudia is LRIC's livestock and greenhouse gases expert.
Yes, so good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for this introduction, Chloe and Mike. I'm pleased to be here, and I will start right away, and we'll see if we get lots of time for questions. So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Jayasundara, who's also on the line, who has done a lot of the work I'll be presenting. And I'm going to start off with the headlines. You've all seen these. There's a lot of information, a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of times when the information is presented, it's not wrong, but in perhaps a misleading way. For example, here on the bottom left corner, where we have the impact of one glass of different milks. I know there's an issue of calling these other sources milk, but this is per glass of milk as opposed to protein, right? So there's lots of ways we can express these numbers, and I'm hopefully through my, by the end of my presentation, you'll have a bit better appreciation of how these numbers can, or where they come from. But I'm going to start with kind of back to the basics, the primer on greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect. So the natural greenhouse effect is a plus 33 degrees warming. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, the temperature of the Earth would be at -18. And we think of other planets where sometimes we have like runaway greenhouse gas effect. And so we definitely don't want this to be the case here. Now, recently, or in the last number of years, we've had increases in greenhouse gases, which is really too much of a good thing. The greenhouse gases we're talking about are carbon dioxide, but also methane and nitrous oxide. And these non-CO2 gases are the focus in the agricultural sector, as you will see. The trend in greenhouse gases has been linked to what we call the enhanced greenhouse effect through a number of studies of understanding of the climate system and modeling. You can see this a little bit better in this kind of diagram here of all the countries on Earth from 1880 to 2017. And you can see how it starts off with blue colors, which is negative anomaly compared to currently. and ends up very red. So there's definitely no discussion that that's happening, this enhanced greenhouse gas effect. And there's a huge social cost of these emissions, be it in the form of storms, flooding, drought, so that there's really a big need to address the greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to start with some of the metrics or the numbers in terms globally. And you've probably heard this stats of about a fourth of greenhouse gas emissions come from the agricultural sector. That is this part of the pie, so to speak here. About half of the 24%, so 12%, is due to on-farm emissions. The rest is due to land use change, such as deforestation and so on. So that's depending on what is included in the number, what gets grouped or not, results in slightly different or sometimes quite different stats. When we get to Canada, then that number is 10%, so not too far off the 12%. And nowhere here on this diagram you see the land use change. And that's because for Canada, land use change is a negative value because our forests and our soils take up more carbon from the atmosphere than they put in, although that number has been decreasing over time. So there is some concern with that. So, and I should say that the source of information is Environment Canada and Climate Change that produces a national inventory report following guidelines from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's done by all the signatory countries. So that's a good place to go if there are questions, and they also release these per province. Now, you may ask, why focus just on this piece of the pie? It's relatively small, it's only 10%. And my view on this is, well, the agricultural sector owns 100% of it, right? So that's our piece of the pie. So for the agricultural sector, that's where interest is. And I'm not going to go into carbon credits, but for other sectors, there may be interest in reducing this part of the pie because it's more cost effective than doing it for the other parts. And I should say, so livestock sector is more than 50% of that 10%. In Ontario, the numbers are slightly different, but again, agriculture as a whole is 8% compared to the 10% for Canada. And I should also point out that these numbers, both in this slide and in the previous slide, they include fossil fuel use in agriculture. That was not always the case, that was included in the agricultural sector when reporting, but it doesn't include things like the production of fertilizer, which goes into heavy industry. So sometimes numbers are conflicting because it depends on how you sort of slice that pie. So if we go to then those 10%, they are coming from livestock, from enteric fermentation, from manure storage, both in liquid or solid form, from soils after manure application or after fertilizer application. And here you can see how really the sector predominates methane and nitrous oxide, where CO2 is either emitted just from the energy used in agriculture or is emitted or taken up by soils through the CO2 shown here. So on-farm fuel use is about 20%, crop production is 33%, but the carbon lost or gained by soils through no-till, which doesn't apply for Eastern Ontario, but for Western Ontario, is reported under a separate category, which is land use change, and forestry. So that is a negative number. So it could you know, it could be reported slightly different, but it's just following conventions by the UN. And then livestock production is 49%, so about half of the agricultural emissions. Now, I wanted to concentrate, I'll go back here, concentrate on the enteric fermentation part for a minute. And you will see things like this, and I feel like always saying it's not cow farts, but that's how people frame it. And sometimes there is, you know, how about the bisons? But there was research, so a big X through that, that has shown that these emissions as potentially associated with the bison herds are not close to what cattle emissions are. So let's set that aside and just focus on the fact that emissions of methane are due to burping, and that they are associated with the rumen, which is a beautiful natural contraption, but has that sort of side effect. And only a very small part comes out the back end. If we look at Ontario, more than half of the agricultural emissions are due to livestock. And if we look at this part here, which is the enteric fermentation, the majority, like close to 100%, is beef and dairy, and there's about a half and half split between those. Now for the manure part, the picture looks like slightly different, where we have dairy and swine dominating, and that's because of the liquid manure storage nature of these industries compared to beef, which has much less percentage. So liquid manure produces a lot of methane, and that's why it looks like that. Now, this sort of livestock part does not include the feed production that is under the soils component here, which in a complete life cycle analysis would have to be attributed to the livestock sector. So again, that impacts some of the numbers. And I just included this slide, as you may guess from the previous ones. Poultry and other livestock contribute very little, with the majority, again, so an even split between dairy and beef, and then swine in third place. Now, the other ways of expressing these numbers, I've kind of already alluded to a little bit, is what we then call the carbon footprint. So we express all these, the methane, the nitrous oxide, and the CO2, added up all together. And the difference here is that this along the whole supply chain, as well as the product that's being produced, is important. So an example here given is that how much the carbon footprint is of an individual person in North America. And you can see that the food accounts for about 15%. So, you know, an argument could be made that changing diets is not actually going to solve the problem. And I agree with that if we don't do anything about travel, about home heating, and so on. But again, the green part of this pie is what the agricultural sector in a way owns. So it is important for the industry, and I think it's really important that LRIC has a session like this, is to become aware and see what can the sector do. So if we do that carbon footprint analysis, considering even the consumption, you know, the retail, like keeping the milk refrigerated, for example, using milk as an example, even if you consider all of that, the transport and so on, the production, what happens on the farm, both in the form of feed or milk production, is 70% of that carbon footprint. So that's why there's a lot of interest in having foods labeled, and also for offsetting these emissions somehow. So this life cycle analysis sometimes is done cradle to farm gate. And this is an example of one that we did for Ontario milk. And you consider everything upstream. So what's produced, energy used in like fertilizer production, what happens on the farm, and then the products, and then the carbon footprint is apportioned to these products according to some rules that are international standards. So with that, you have, you know, milk, what the carbon footprint is. So we've done two types of analysis on this. One was over time using Stats Canada data. And what we've seen is that from 1991 to 2011, the carbon footprint improved quite a bit. So it fell relative to 1991 values. And that has to do with efficiency of production. We're producing more milk per cow, so we need less cows, the feed use efficiency, the land use efficiency, manure production in terms of nitrogen excreted, all of these metrics have improved. The second analysis that we've done was based on ODFAP data. So that's based on 200 farms surveyed over 3 years. And we were interested in seeing how variable the carbon footprint is between farms and if that was any relation to profits. So the carbon footprint also followed a bell-shaped curve like the one shown for profit. So there's some people making lots of money, some making less. And the interesting thing was that there was a synergy between the carbon footprint and profits, meaning that the farms with the lowest profits had the highest carbon footprint, and the ones with the highest profit had the lowest carbon footprint. So as an industry, it would be of interest to see, can we move these lower percentage profit, high carbon footprint people this way, right? So can we shift the whole curve and making it maybe less broad and more narrow. Now, in comparison to globally, all the analysis done by us and by other people from Ag Canada out west shows that we are at the quite a bit lower range of the carbon footprint. So in our case here, and there is a big spread. So we had some farms that were up to 60 or 70, as I just mentioned. Oops. And then for beef, the same thing. We are in the lower end of what is shown here globally. But it becomes clear that ruminants have a much higher carbon footprint than pork or chicken because of that, of what happens in the rumen. So I used the slide and I talked for dairy farmers, and I kind of think that that's a way to take the message is to say, yes, cows do produce methane, they burp it, and they do that because they have a rumen that converts food that we can't eat into good nutritious food plus methane as a side product. And here are all the things that the industry is doing to reduce the carbon footprint. So it's a continuous improvement. So things have improved over the last 20 years, but we're on a road to improve things even more. And there are different measures that could be more widespread. I'm not going to get into each one of these, but just to give you a sense, there are things that can be done with the herd and in the barn, to manure storage and like treatment or manure storage. And then in the field, you know, applying the 4 Rs is something that is gaining more traction and would definitely help. Now, I haven't talked anything about carbon sequestration. So in the last few slides, I will refer to that. So there's a lot of interest from large companies to offset their emissions. And they're looking to agriculture as a way to do that. And I know the first webinar in this series was on regenerative agriculture. So you've heard about that. I just want to, again, to give you a bit of numbers on this. If we consider in the analysis that we have done a very preliminary estimate of carbon sequestration in pasture and perennials, crops that used in beef production in either northern or southern Ontario, we see that they can significantly offset these emissions. So that makes a big difference. And in a recent analysis for Canada, what they've looked at is the fact that with beef cattle declines, there has been a lot of conversion from perennial to annual crops. But with what is left, avoiding that carbon loss could offset 62% of the current emissions. So that is a really important message for the sector. So there is a lot of confusion also on the side of carbon sequestration. Here is a quote that I've taken from a publication where the reference is basically, well, there's lots of carbon. Look at that corn that has taken up lots of carbon. But really, it's more complicated than that. The above ground biomass in a good yielding crop would be about 10 tons of carbon per hectare. 5 of that is removed, fed to animals or to people, and returns to the atmosphere. So that's basically doesn't count. Half is left in the field, but those 5 tons, after 1 year, more than 75% is lost, and then over time as well. So really what we're interested in is the rate of change. So just taking a very broad range here for soil carbon, so how much carbon is in soil. What we want is the change on top of what is already stored there. So we want to avoid loss once a conversion is made, or we want to improve management to gain carbon over time. This is a slow process, but it can be done. So here are a number of ways to either increase carbon input or reduce losses. So, reducing tillage in some places depends on weather and soil type, but also a lot of those concepts of regenerative agriculture apply here. So in the end, we've been hearing a lot about soil health, and here are things that can be done to keep soils healthy. They have a lot of benefits, not just for carbon sequestration, but also for resilience to climate change. So going back to those impacts and the social cost of carbon and of greenhouse gas emissions, farmers in some way are also paying the price for that with more frequent droughts and so on. So keeping soils healthy, we deal with 2 of the aspects, both the adaptation to climate change and mitigation. And integrating livestock and crops is something that is gaining a lot of interest. So I'm going to leave this slide up for conclusions, and would be happy to take questions from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Claudia. That didn't have a lot of questions come in. I think that people were quite interested in getting the real numbers and understanding them.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question regarding, what are your thoughts regarding the carbon cycle that's involved with methane converting to CO2 and then being captured in feed?
Right. So I know that and I was going to mention that, but thought there was already a lot of information. So there is a working group, I know, at the global level, looking at what is called the global warming potential that is used to make those conversions of methane to CO2, so that we can add all of them up as CO2 equivalent. And there is methane gets destroyed in the atmosphere, and there's a lifetime or how long it stays in the atmosphere is considered in those calculations. So they're looking at revising those numbers, and that would have an impact. But for now, we go with the numbers we have. And I hope I've answered that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it was when you were talking about the soils, and the question came in is, do you believe the situation will get better, or are the roadblocks that will prevent that from occurring?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so recently I gave a talk if there's a future where farmers get paid for carbon sequestration. And my answer was maybe right, you know, like it's complex, but I think the roadblocks are, you know, their costs, who pays for things. So a lot of the measures that I showed, some of those involve investment, but I'm finding that more and more there's huge interest from government and particularly the industry. So food companies are really looking very seriously at the farm production side to try to, they've all made commitments for net zero or reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think some of those roadblocks will be removed through that interest and additional investment for that to occur. But definitely there are roadblocks along the way.
That's for sure. Here's another one. How can we promote reduction in livestock carbon footprint based on our agricultural practices? No, sorry. It's how do we promote reduction in livestock's carbon footprint to primary producers?
So if I understand the question correctly, meaning the feed producers, I think it's all about finding efficiencies in the system and being proactive. A lot of, as you've heard in the last webinar about regenerative agriculture, which is a new term being used, but I think investing in soils and efficiencies in your whole operation are investments that in the long run pay off. So the promotion has to be from the economic side, from the efficiency side. It's sort of what is in it for you is that, you know, your operation becomes more resilient if the soil is healthy. You know, water issues, flooding or like getting too wet or too dry will be made more stable over time. So I think that is kind of the message to go.
Okay. Through. All right. How can farmers qualify and validate measuring carbon?
Yeah, so that is one of the big question marks as we move forward. So I use that example of Microsoft. How will they validate those credits? Because there is a fairly rigid system in place in terms of what qualifies. It's not just saying, oh, I did this and I qualify. They all have to be, the carbon credits have to be, you know, real and added, like the change has to be made to get the credits in a certain way following a protocol. So I think that so it's a serious business, and in the end, things I think will become easier as more and more interest is made and once these protocols are put into place. So the measurement part will become, everyone agrees that measuring, or I think most people agree that measuring is not something that you would do on a day-to-day basis. It would be do measurements, calibrate a model, and then use modeling and remote sensing to verify. because it just costs too much and the variability is too high to do it sort of at the farm level, at least for carbon. I think for nitrous oxide and methane, there may be sensors developed that could do that verification over time.
Yeah. All right. What are your thoughts on differentiating between greenhouse gas from fossil fuels, which would have remained sequestered if they hadn't been extracted, versus biological greenhouse gas, which has been cycling between the atmosphere and the top 6 inches of soil for millennia?
Mm-hmm. Right. So definitely a distinction is made. So I think when we look at nitrous oxide, for example, that is nitrogen that is being synthetic nitrogen and or enhanced legume fixing that is being added. So for the nitrogen cycle, we definitely have enhanced that cycle the same way we've done with the carbon cycle. We're actually adding just as much from an anthropogenic source as a natural source. And for the methane part, it's all about, you know, a carbon that would have produced CO2 and instead it's producing methane. And that is why there is, it's recycling, but it's having a different impact. So I think that's in a way already kind of taken into account.
Okay. And this kind of leads into another question that's been put forward is that, so how have soils and nitrous oxide emissions been this spring, above or below average?
This spring?
Yeah, this spring.
My research group has done a lot of work on release of nitrous oxide due to spring thaw. So that is a mechanism, like we don't need to get into the details, but it happens in agricultural soil and it's related to nitrogen fertilization and nitrogen management on farms. So, and what we've seen is more freezing of soil, bigger N2O. So as you know, we've had a relatively cold winter this winter compared to previous. And I just by coincidence saw the data today. And what we've seen is a big emission, but more exciting, half of our field had cover crops in the fall, and the cover crops, they trap more snow, the soil freezes less. So looks like we have a significant reduction due to the cover crop use. So I'm excited about that.
Well, that might lead right into our very next question. And what would you see as the biggest bang for the buck in terms of mitigation options?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my work always has been on the biophysical side. I've collaborated with agriculture economists really for that question about the economic, like how much does all of that cost? So I'm afraid I don't have a straight answer to that, but I think, you know, it depends on who is bearing the costs, right? So we see those, for example, for manure management, we have very expensive technology like anaerobic digestion versus more simpler things like if you completely empty the manure tank, so don't leave any inoculum, the emissions are a lot, like more than 50% lower. Now that is something that we may say, well, that doesn't cost that much, but there's no free lunch, right? So that affects, you still have to go in and dig out all the inoculum, or sort of the leftover manure, and you know, you need to fit that into your operations. So I think the ones that are more attractive are some that are win-win-win, and I think like cover crops do fall under that. but there is a big learning curve. So we see innovative farmers that are making it work. And then there are others that are more cautious and that maybe would need some assistance just to be able to try it and learn about it on their farm, like take more risk, I guess.
All right. And I think this is going to be our last question that you've presented a lot of data on the dairy sector because you've done a lot of work in that area. Are there other sectors doing enough to document their own reality and then identifying what they can do to lower their emissions?
Mm-hmm. So I think like at the national level, the beef sector is very proactive and has put out a lot of information about their carbon footprint improvements and other environmental goods and services. I haven't heard much at all from poultry, and the reason, I guess, it is a relatively small component. And swine, I've done work on emissions from swine manure many eons ago, it seems now, when Jean was still at Ontario Pork.
That was a few years ago.
Yes, and I haven't been involved lately. That doesn't mean that there isn't work going on, but I think it has been less of a priority. So yeah, I think overall the industry, I think, has been, the livestock industry has been quite proactive. I think where we need to get on board is more farmers, right? And I have seen a shift from when I first talked to dairy farmers many years ago as well to now, because I think at that time it was very, I could feel the room. There was not a lot of interest and sort of like, why are we talking about this? While now there are more questions and a lot more awareness.
Okay. Well, Claudia, I want to thank you very much for your presentation, for working with us and editing the white paper. Nobody has seen, but Charlotte Wall is behind the scenes here doing a whole bunch of technical assistance and keeping us all moving. Chloe gets a lot of credit for pulling this together and working with Claudia and Mike and Susantha, who is Claudia's research assistant. Just to encourage people that this was recorded, it will be available on our website early next week. We'll get it up. We will send you a note to let you know it's there. If there's questions we didn't get to, we will send them out to Claudia and send you back some answers on those. Our next webinar is going to be on April 21st, and it's going to be with Jean Scott-Nicky on antimicrobial use and resistance. That you're welcome to follow us along. We do send out a newsletter. You can sign up on our website, and you can follow us on Twitter. Thanks very much for your participation today and joining us.
Thank you.